Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission American Eel Management Board. I'm calling this meeting to order. I'm Chris Kuhn, the administrative proxy for Pennsylvania and current chair of the American Eel Board. Currently, we have the vice chair position vacant, but we'll be considering filling that role later in this meeting. Our technical committee chair is Danielle Hardy from South Carolina. And we have new advisory panel chair, Mitch Feinenbaum from Pennsylvania. Mitch is certainly not new to the AP or ASMFC participation, but I'd like to welcome him into his renewed role as AP chair. I'd also like to thank our previous AP chair, Mary Beth DeLuca, with the Nature Conservancy for her longstanding service and leadership in that capacity. Our law enforcement committee representative is Rob Beal from Maine, and I'm joined here at the front table by Caitlin Starks and Dr. Kristen Anstead with the commission, law enforcement committee rep Rob Beal, and AP chair Mitch Feinenbaum. So we have a full agenda here this afternoon. So let's go ahead and get started with this afternoon's business, the first order of which is approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed modifications to the agenda? Any hands online? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. So next up, approval of proceedings from the January 2024 board meeting. Are there any edits to the proceedings from the January 2024 meeting of the American Eel Management Board? Okay, seeing none there again. They're approved by consent. So now we'll move on to the public comment period. There are a number of, are there any members of the public, either here or online, that would like to make comments pertaining to items that are not on today's agenda? Again, this is only for items that are not on the agenda. Depending on time, you will be given additional opportunity to comment on motions for specific items to be covered in the agenda later in this meeting. Also, as a reminder to commissioners and others making comments in the room, please move your microphone down and ensure that is turned on when speaking so we can hear you. Anyone wishing to make public comment at this time for items not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on to the fourth item that's on the agenda, which is to consider addendum 6 pertaining to Maine glass eel quota for final approval. Draft addendum 6 was approved for public comment in January, and today the board needs to select management options and implementation dates and provide final approval of addendum 6. Specifically, this includes deciding upon Maine's glass eel quota and a time frame for implementation. Caitlin Starks is going to start us off with a presentation. Following that, I'll turn it over to AP Chair Mitch Feinenbaum for an advisory panel report pertaining to specifically addendum 6, and then we'll take questions on the presentation and report. Caitlin, we're ready for your presentation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to go over eel draft addendum 6. Again, this is on Maine glass eel quota and eel elver management. So I'm going to start with the background and statement of the problem for this addendum, and then go over the proposed management options, a summary of the public comments, and then we'll go over to the AP chair for the AP report, and finally the board actions for consideration today. So draft addendum 6 was initiated in August 2023 when the board moved to initiate an addendum to address the Maine glass eel quota. And following that meeting, the plan development team, PDT, developed the draft addendum document for public comment. Our public comment period was in February and March of this year. And then today the board will consider those comments and take final action on this addendum. So if approved today, the implementation of the measures is expected in time for January 2025. And that timeline is important. And the reason for this addendum is because Maine's commercial glass eel quota expires after this year, and so it needs to be reestablished for 2025 and beyond. And the quota was set for 2015 through 2017 at 9,688 pounds by addendum 4 in 2014, And then Addendum 5 maintained the same quota, which was extended through board action through 2024. However, the addenda and a new addendum was needed for fishing beyond 2024. Right, so now I'll just go through the proposed management options. This is a pretty short and sweet addendum. So the first couple options here, well, one option is related to the Maine glass eel quota level. Option 1 is status quo. That would be 9,688 pounds. So this is maintaining the same quota that's been in place since 2015. And before the addendum was approved for public comment, there was an additional option to consider reducing that quota, but the board decided to remove that option from consideration. And so if no action is taken on this addendum, then there would not be a quota for Maine in the commission's FMP. The next set of options is section 3.2, and these address the duration of the quota that's established, will be established at final action. So option 1 is for no sunset, and that would mean the Maine glass eel quota would just remain the same indefinitely unless changed through another addendum or amendment. And then option 2 is a 3-year duration, after which the board would be required to initiate a new addendum to establish Maine's glass eel quota for 2028 and beyond. And then option 3 is a 3-year duration, after which the board could extend the same quota indefinitely via board action. However, if a change to the quota is desired under this option, there would still need to be a new addendum and public input process. Right, so now for the public comment summary. During our comment period, we had one virtual public hearing, and that was held at the end of February. We had 23 attendees from the public, but no comments were provided during that hearing. We received 35 total written comments, and I want to note that this number is revised from what was in the memo in the materials in order to account for all of the signatories that were signed on to a single comment when there was more than one. And so we had 33 individual comments and 2 letters from organizations. This table summarizes the support for each of the options in the addendum. So 34 of the 35 written comments indicated support for the status quo quota option. And then for the quota duration, 6 indicated support for the no sunset option, and 1 favored option 2, which would require a new addendum after 3 years. In the comments that supported the status quo quota option, the rationales included that they're seeing plentiful numbers of elvers in Maine, and the harvesters are easily able to fill their quotas early in the season. Some comments mention that they think the Maine fishery is already well managed and regulated, and also that the state has laws and conducts conservation efforts to allow harvest to continue without depleting the population. And a few folks also noted that Maine is unique in that there's large amounts of habitat for eels in the state. So under section 3.2 on the quota duration, for those that supported option 1 for no sunset, the reasoning was just generally that the quota is working and it should stay in place. And then from the one comment that supported option 2, which was from the Passamaquoddy tribe, the letter expressed that the quota should be fully reviewed in 3 years so that any necessary adjustments to that quota can be made based on changing conditions and information. And additionally, that full review in 3 years would allow for an opportunity for the commission to engage with and coordinate with the tribe with regard to this Maine glass eel fishery. And then we had some additional comments that were not related to a specific option in the addendum, but 3 comments said that Maine's glass eel quota should be increased rather than stay the same. And they think that it wouldn't hurt the biomass given the small number of fishermen, and also because there should be some credit given back to the fishery for dam removals and other habitat restoration projects. And then one comment expressed that states without glass eel fisheries shouldn't get to vote on Maine's management. And one individual favored reducing or ending glass eel harvest because of the species stock status. So in the comment letter from the Passamaquoddy tribe, there were a few other points raised about the commission's management. First, the letter stated that the commission should consult with the tribe before proposing any management actions that would affect American eel and other species in their region. And it also noted the opinion that ASMFC and its partners should prioritize population and habitat restoration efforts in eel management over harvest quotas. Right, so now I can pass it over to Mitch for the AP report.
Thank you, Caitlin. I can report that 2 of 5 AP members present at our meeting were representing Maine. Both supported option 1 on the quota as well as on the quota timeframe. 2 of the other 3 AP members either supported or offered no opinion about the views of their colleagues from Maine. Not only Maine's AP members, but attendees at the state public meeting report that glacial runs are strong and note that the quota is easily reached every year. I apologize for the redundancy. They cite the reduction of adult eel fisheries and an impressive record of dam removal as proof of the state's responsible approach to species management. While the harvester community in Maine asks the board to consider increases to the state's glacial quota, this matter was not addressed by the AP since it was not an option for consideration in the addendum. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just have one more slide to wrap up. So the first item for the board's consideration today would be the selection of management measures, and then followed by the final approval of Addendum 6.
Thank you, Caitlin and Mitch. So at this point, we'll take questions on the presentation for Caitlin or Mitch on the AP report. Yes, Dan McKernan.
Could I get clarification on, Mitch, the third bullet referencing the reduction of adult eel fisheries in Maine? Does Maine prohibit yellow eel harvest?
It's my understanding that they do. I know that when rules were imposed in Maine to eliminate the silver eel fishery and adult eel harvesting, there was grandfathering that was imposed or implemented, and I don't know the status of that. Perhaps the folks from Maine could answer better.
Any additional questions in the room for Caitlin or Mitch? Okay, seeing none, do we have any hands online? Okay, we have a hand from a member of the public online, but we're going to go ahead and hold that until we get to motions. You'll have an opportunity to speak once we get to motions. So, okay, if there are no more questions on the presentation or the AP report, let's go ahead and open it up to the board for discussion on the presentation. Megan Ware.
Thank you. I had sent staff a motion to get our conversation started today.
We're getting that up on the board now. It looks like it's up there.
For draft addendum 6, move to select under 3.1 Maine glacial quota, option 1 status quo, 9,688 pound quota, and under 3.2 timeframe for Maine glacial quota, option 3, 3 years with the ability to extend via board action.
Okay, do we have a second? Doug Grout. Okay, Megan, as maker of the motion, would like to provide some additional comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I would certainly support maintaining our existing quota and prefer that to not managing this fishery under a quota, which would be what we get if we don't choose option 1 today. Just to echo some of my comments from our meeting in January, there's no recommendation coming out of the assessment for a reduction in Maine glacial quota. Our young of year survey trends have been steadily increasing, and the assessment's pretty clear that harvesting glacials has a lower impact on the population given the high natural mortality at that life stage. In terms of the time frame, I believe our system for reviewing the glacial quota every 3 years has worked well. And I hope that that provides a little more comfort to the board today with the status quo quota. I like option 3 from an efficiency standpoint because it does allow for board action if the board decides to maintain the quota after 3 years.
Doug, would you like to provide some additional comments?
No, sir.
Okay, before we go to the board for discussion on the motion, I'll now accept some public comments specific to the motion. Do we have any members of the public that would like to speak or make a comment specific to this motion? Any hands online? Okay, no hands online. Okay, let's bring this back to the board for discussion on the motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing none. I guess we're at the point where we can call the question. Is there a need to caucus before the vote? Caucus, will take 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes are up. Is there any need for further discussion? Caucus? Okay, seeing none, we'll try and do this the easy way. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by consent. Okay, so at this time, we're ready to consider final approval of Addendum 6. Is there anyone willing to make that motion? Megan, where?
Yes, I'm happy to make that motion. Move to approve Addendum 6 to the American Eel FMP as modified today.
We have a second. John Clark? Megan, would you like to speak to that?
I don't have any comments.
John Clark? Okay, again, we'll do this the easy way. Is there any opposition to the motion? Okay, seeing none, the motion is approved by board consent. We'll go ahead and move on to item 5 on the agenda, which is to consider Addendum 7 on yellow eel coastwide cap and monitoring requirements for final approval. Addendum 7 was approved for public comment in January, and today the board needs to select management options and implementation dates and decide upon final approval of Addendum 7. Specifically, this includes deciding upon the coastwide cap, the management response to exceeding the coastwide cap, time frame for how long the selected coastwide cap would remain in place, annual young a year abundance survey requirements, catch and effort monitoring requirements, and the American eel de minimis criteria. So Caitlin Starks again is going to lead us into questions and discussion with a presentation. Then we'll hear the AP report on Addendum 7 from AP Chair Mitch Fonnebaum. Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this will be very similar in structure to the last presentation. I'll go over some background information and statement of the problem, the proposed management options, which are going to be a lot lengthier than the last presentation, and then the public comment summary before going to our AP chair. So Addendum 7 responds to the 2023 stock assessment, which maintains the depleted stock status and recommends reducing the catch of yellow eel. To date, the assessment hasn't been able to provide us with biologically based reference points for use for management. So instead, the board has managed yellow eel, using a coastwide catch cap, and that's based on historical yellow eel landings. So the most recent assessment is still unable to provide these biological reference points, but it did identify a tool that we could use to inform management of yellow eel using fishery independent abundance indices and coastwide landings to provide catch advice. So this is called iTarget, and we'll talk about iTarget some more later. This graph just shows the yellow eel abundance index, which is the dotted gray line, and the coastwide landings, which is the black line. And you can see the decline in both of these indices over time. So the board initiated this addendum specifying in their motion that we should consider using iTarget to recommend various catch caps for the yellow eel commercial fishery, but not use iTarget to set biological reference points or stock status. This addendum also considers some changes to monitoring requirements based on recommendations from the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and Technical Committee. First, the 2023 assessment indicated that biological sampling in the young of year surveys that's required, specifically the individual lengths and pigment stage, could be made optional because these data haven't been able to inform coastwide trends in the stock. And additionally, it notes that the catch per unit effort data that are provided by states haven't been used in any of the stock assessments, as was the intention for those data, because they have also not been indicative of trends in the stock as a whole. So as a reminder, this addendum was initiated last August, and after the board reviewed the 2023 benchmark, and in the fall, the plan development team put together the management options and the document, and we had our public hearings and comment period in February and March at the same time as Addendum 6. And so today we're also having the board discuss the comments and consider final approval of the addendum. So to go over the management options, these are the 5 sections of the addenda that we'll talk through today. So we have options on the commercial yellow eel coastwide cap and the management response to exceeding the cap, timeframe options for that cap, young of year abundance survey requirements, catch and effort monitoring program requirements, and then finally de minimis status. So starting with the coastwide cap, issue 1 under 3.1. This deals with the cap level itself. So our current cap is 916,473 pounds, and that is based on the average landings from 1998 to 2010. So this is our status quo option. And then there are 4 additional options which propose a range of alternative harvest caps using that iTarget tool that was recommended in the assessment. So just a quick reminder on iTarget. This is a trend-based tool for managing data-limited fisheries, and it uses data from landings and abundance indices and provides a range of catch limit recommendations based on trends in catch, abundance, and management goals. So essentially, the inputs into iTarget are the historical catch and abundance trends, where catch and abundance levels currently are, and then the target abundance of where we want to be. And then as an output, iTarget provides us with a catch recommendation for getting to that target abundance level. So in addition to those basics, there are these 3 variables in iTarget that need to be defined in order to configure the tool. So we have the reference period, the multiplier, and the threshold, and these are the knobs that the board needs to adjust. So the reference period is meant to be a time period where the population is stable or at a desirable abundance level. And this is the time period of abundance that we're comparing our target abundance to. The multiplier determines the level of abundance that management is aiming to achieve. And so if the multiplier is set to 1, that means you're aiming to achieve the same abundance from the reference period. If you set the multiplier to 1.25, that means you're aiming to achieve an abundance level that's 25% higher than the abundance from the reference period. So that's how that functions. The threshold value is a portion of the iTarget value that's dependent on the goals of the fishery. So a threshold value of 0.5 is a less conservative value and generally results in higher catch caps. And a threshold of 0.8 is a more conservative value that generally results in lower catch caps, and that's our range for the threshold options. So the options that use iTarget to recommend the catch caps, there are 2 different reference periods that are considered. So those are shown in this graph in the blue and yellow shaded areas. So the blue shaded area is the earlier reference period, which is 1974 to 1987. And in that period, the abundance index was at a higher level. So that represents a more desirable abundance level. And then in the yellow area, there's the later reference period, which is a lower level of abundance, but still above abundance levels in the most recent decades. And then this table is showing the 4 proposed options for coastwide caps that use iTarget. So option 2 and 3, which are highlighted in blue, they use the earlier reference period and a multiplier value of 1.25. So they are using the same multiplier value and reference period, which means they're aiming to achieve the same level of stock abundance. And that's 25% greater than the stock abundance during that reference period. They differ in that option 2 uses a threshold of 0.8 and option 3 uses a threshold of 0.5. So the 0.8 threshold results in a coastwide cap of 202,453 pounds, and the 0.5 threshold results in 518,281 pounds, and that's based on the conservativeness of those 2 options. And then option 4 and 5 use the later reference period, which is 1988 to 1999. And they both use a threshold value of 0.5, but option 4 uses a multiplier of 1.5 and option 5 uses a multiplier of 1.25. So this means these 2 options are aiming for 2 different levels of stock abundance. Option 4 is aiming for 50% higher than the abundance during the reference period, and option 5 is aiming for 25% greater than that abundance level. And then this graph just shows those 4 options for coastwide caps compared to the current coastwide cap, which is the black dashed line at the top, as well as the coastwide yellow eel landing since 2015. Right, so the next set of options are related to the management response for if that coastwide cap is exceeded. Our status quo option is that if landings exceed the cap by 10% for 2 consecutive years, then the states whose landings are greater than 1% of the coastwide total landings in those years would be responsible for reducing their landings to come back down to that coastwide cap in a subsequent year. Option 2 modifies this slightly so that it would be a response by the states whose landings are greater than 5% of the coastwide landings being responsible for reducing their landings. And that just changes the number of states really that would be responsible. So to show that difference in this table, we have some yellow and gray shaded cells. All of these cells are states that had landings greater than 1% of the coastwide landings in each year. And then just the gray cells are those states with greater than 5% of the total in each year. So moving on to our options for timeframes. Option 1 is that the cap would not have a sunset date, but that it would need to remain in place for 3 years before being updated. And that 3-year minimum time frame was recommended because less than 3 years of data wouldn't be as sufficient to evaluate the performance of that cap. And then option 2 is that the cap would, again, not have a sunset date, but that it would have to remain in place for 5 years before being updated. And to clarify what updating the cap means under these options, it would be that additional years of data, whether it's 3 or 5, would be run through the iTarget tool as it's configured. It doesn't mean it would be able to change the reference period, multiplier, or threshold values. Right, next are the options related to the Young of Year survey sampling. Option 1 is status quo, and this would mean the states must continue to collect individual length and pigment stage during the Young of Year surveys. And option 2 is that the biological sampling of those 2 things would become optional, and that was recommended by the SAS in the 2023 assessment. For section 3.4, we have 2 options regarding the fishery dependent catch and effort monitoring. Option 1, status quo, would maintain the requirement for harvester reporting of trip level catch per unit effort data, and that was established by Addendum 1. And this means the states would continue to require those CPUE data in harvester reports, including soak time, number of units of gear fished, and pounds landed. And then option 2 would be that the states would no longer be required to collect those trip level CPUE data for yellow eel catch. The states would be able to continue that collection of the data if they chose to. And the majority of states indicated that they would likely continue collecting those data even if it were voluntary. But as a note, this option does not apply to glass eel. It just applies to the yellow eel surveys. So. And then our last section is de minimis status options. So the commission approved a new standard for the de minimis policy, and that's to use an average of 3 years of landings to evaluate whether a state meets the de minimis criteria. So our status quo option would be to continue using 2 years, which is what is currently in the eel FMP. And option 2 would be to update the eel FMP to use the 3-year average, which is now the commission standard. And if option 1 is chosen, then our policy indicates that the board would need to provide a rationale for why 2 years is more appropriate for this species. All right, so now we can go through the summary of public comments on this addendum. We had 6 public hearings during the comment period for Addendum 7 in February and March, and combined, the attendance across all of those hearings was 37 individuals, and 23 comments were provided at hearings. We also received a total of 10 written comments on the addendum, 9 of which were from individuals and one letter from the Maryland Watermen's Association. This table just summarizes the support for the different options indicated by the comments. And the main takeaway here is that the public generally supported the status quo option for the coastwide cap for yellow eel. Only one person commented in favor of a different option, which was option 5. And there was not a strong response about the other options in the addendum. So 3 people supported the status quo management response to exceeding the coastwide cap. 6 supported the time frame option for 3 years before the cap is updated, and 3 supported the 5-year option. And then 3 people supported status quo for keeping the requirements for young of year biosampling, and 3 supported status quo for keeping the requirement for trip level harvester CPUE data, and 3 supported status quo for de minimis. So as you just saw, we got 28 comments in favor of the status quo coastwide cap, and the rationales given were that the fishery does not have an overfished or overfishing status, that effort and landings for yellow eel have declined because of the market and fishing costs, not because of decreased eel abundance. The status quo option would allow for the fishery to grow back to previous levels if the market were to recover in the future. And they also commented that more data are needed for the years after COVID when things came back to normal, more back to normal. And then the one individual in favor of option 5 noted that this option would also still allow for growth of the fishery and wouldn't limit it too much. So regarding the time frame for the coastwide cap, there was more support for the 3-year option. General thinking behind that was that within 3 years, the data could be improved and the update to the cap would possibly benefit the fishery sooner rather than later. And then the 3 individuals in favor of the 5-year time frame just preferred having more years of data. For the young of year biosampling, the support was mainly for status quo, but there weren't really reasons provided for that. For the CPUE data collection options, the supporters of status quo did express some concerns about losing that information on harvester CPUE because they do think it's important for assessing the fishery. And then for the de minimis options, 3 were in support of status quo, but again, no reasons were given. And then these are some additional comments we received during the period of public comment that weren't necessarily tied to certain options in the addendum. Several folks commented that we do not need any changes for yellow eel management. There was also a group that commented about the coastwide cap option, saying that even though they prefer status quo, they were skeptical that status quo would be the outcome of the board's decision. So they wanted to emphasize that option 5 was the next best option in their opinion. And then a few individuals mentioned that we need better data for assessing eel abundance and that the CPUE data would be better if they were collected by fishermen who have more experience and know how to catch eels. And there were also some comments that mentioned some concerns about illegal catch of undersized eel and foreign aquaculture markets, both affecting the U.S. industry in a negative way. There was also one person that commented that eel catch would be better if horseshoe crab harvests were allowed in New Jersey, and another said that eel catch did significantly decrease when the female horseshoe crab harvest was banned. So now we'll go over to the AP chair for the AP report.
Thank you, Caitlin. On the question of the coastwide cap, issue 1, 3 of 5 AP members favored status quo, questioning how a cap reduction could be justified in an era of historic low fishing effort and with a stock status that does not find overfishing taking place. This was the dominant position of public comments made at the state meetings. While supporting status quo, the AP member most closely connected to the processing and export industry acknowledged that option 5 would cause little short-term disruption. At the same time, this member warned that option 2 is draconian and could bring an end to the commercial fishery altogether. One of Maine's AP members expressed no position on the coastwide cap options. The AP member from the NGO sector supported option 3 for the coastwide cap, believing that the data supports a more precautionary approach, including some data from outside the ASMSC range. On issue 2, the AP's feedback was that the panel members had no preference between the 2 options. As far as the sunset date, 2 AP members spoke in support of option 1, meaning that the cap could be updated after 3 years based on better data and improved modeling. The other AP members offer no comment on the issue. On the issues in option 3.3, all AP members were in favor of option 2, making optional the collection of individual lengths and pigment stages during young of the year surveys. The AP's unanimous position is based on assurances from ASMFC that surveys would continue to distinguish the age classes being sampled. For example, whether they're really year 0 surveys or glass eels, or year 1 surveys, which scientists refer to as ELVers, although commercial fishermen use the terms interchangeably. On issue 3.4, 4 of the AP members favor option 1, status quo. They cited the importance of CPUE information in assessing data poor species. They also noted support for this position in the public comments. The AP member with the longest tenure on the panel at the meeting noticed that the technical committee has previously insisted that favorable catch data may not be used as a stock indicator unless it's accompanied by CPU information. And question how ASMFC could justify an about face at a time of historically low effort when CPU information provides a unique view of stock status. One AP member supported option 2 on the grounds that it was potentially distracting from other priorities in an era of limited resources. The AP members stated unanimously that they have no strong views on item 3.5 and support option 2 if that is the Commission's recommendation. The AP provided some additional feedback. During the meeting, concerns were raised by at least one panel member as well as a public observer representing the processing and exporting sector about the Commission's reliance on the stock status assessment, considering that it's the 3rd different model used for assessing eel stocks in 3 successive assessments. The use of fishery-dependent information in this stock status without any CPUE information, especially in an era of historic low effort, was the source of other questions. There was a feeling that the abundance index misweights fishery-independent data or overweights fishery-independent data that come from areas of commercial fishing that comprise only part of the species' vast U.S. range, and it gives low data surveys equal weight to data-rich surveys. Finally, pointed out that the peer review comments in 3 successive assessments have demonstrated, and the lack of reference points all demonstrate the limited authority of these stock assessments. That's the summary of the AP comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as we just did with Addendum 6, the board's actions for consideration today are to select management measures for Addendum 7 and consider final approval.
Thank you, Caitlin and Mitch, on those presentations. At this time, we can take questions for Caitlin on the presentation and Mitch on his report. Bill Hyatt.
Thank you. Yep, I have a question regarding figure 7 that was in the material, figure 11 that was in the materials that were sent out prior to the meeting. And I think this was presented as a sort of truncated bar chart in your presentation earlier. I'm looking at that and interpreting it as the only option 2 is the only option that departs from the historical harvest pattern that was associated with the depleted condition today. And I just want to make sure that I'm interpreting that figure correctly, if there's any nuances that I should be aware of. Thank you.
Apologies, I'm trying to find figure 7 so I can remind myself which one it is.
It was figure 11.
11. Okay. So you are asking about option 2, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I'm interpreting that as the only one that only option that departs from the historical pattern of harvest that is associated with the depleted condition we have today. The only option that departs from that is number 2. And I'm seeking to any clarification. Are there any nuances that I should be aware of in my interpretation of that?
So the 4 lines, and actually Madeline, I think there is a slide with this on it if you want to pull it up, just so it's clear what I'm talking about. Thank you, Madeline. So this is the figure you were referring to. Those 4 lines with the different colors are the results that iTarget would provide if that year vertical was the final year. So the black line is the catch landings trend, but the 4 different lines are just different results of iTarget based on different configurations of the tool. So the red one at the bottom, which I think is the one you were talking about, that's much lower than the others, that's just the tool using the configuration from option 2, which is 1974 to 1987, 1.25 multiplier and a 0.8 threshold. So what that's telling us is if you use those variables in the configuration of iTarget, it's recommending based on the abundance index, which is not shown in this graph, that the catch in each of those years should have been much lower than the catch that was actually caught in those years.
Does that answer your question, Bill?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the informative answer, Caitlin. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Craig Pugh.
I guess I can make my point through this graph or the other 3-colored bar chart that you had shown earlier. The statements were made in the advisory panel, and they are, I agree with them. They're shown very plainly in the black line here with the dots. You see the reduction towards 1989, and that would include relieving us of a female horseshoe crab. That's when that happened. That's what happened. We moved to a male and then other baits accordingly. I think Mitch could probably confirm what I'm saying timeline wise. He's been involved with the fishery as long as I have. The other baits were not quite as effective, but we still used them. Tried for a few years, didn't really work out. Catch effort has went down. But in no case would the catch effort, can the catch effort imply abundance through this time period? The fact of the matter is either the market went to hell in a handbasket, and it has, and the baits are of a degrading quality. And made
So
the
Craig, is there a
fishery,
question in there? I'm
made
sorry
the
to
fishery a
interrupt.
little tougher for us to get through.
We're taking questions. Is there a question in there? There'll be time for comments later.
Fine.
Question, Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I must be getting late in the day. I didn't navigate through all the empty soda cans and water glasses to get to my microphone here. I just want to make sure I fully understand the mechanics of the iTarget approach and how it's going to potentially play out in coming years. So under issue 3.1, issue 1, the coast-wide cap, if we adopt today any option other than status quo, we are officially adopting the iTarget approach that will become part of the FMP. And we will use iTarget to set coast-wide cap in future years at whatever interval we decide to revisit it. But we will not have an opportunity to change the configuration of the threshold and the multiplier and those values until the next benchmark stock assessment. Is that when there would be an opportunity to adjust those dials? I'm trying to get a sense for, if we officially adopt iTarget today, how long will we be required to use the current configuration we adopt? When will there be an opportunity to change those settings? When would there be an opportunity to stop using iTarget if the board wanted to?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So essentially, if any of those other options is chosen, 2 through 5, it would mean that an addendum would be required to change the configuration of iTarget or to stop using it in the future. So if there were a benchmark stock assessment in 10 years, which is recommended, and things changed and you wanted to use a different configuration or a different management tool, then you could initiate an addendum after that point, or you can initiate an addendum anytime, but it would be required to change the configuration.
Is there any other questions? Yes, Shannon Madsen.
Just a quick correction, Caitlin, I verified with my staff member. I know we only had one guy at our EO meeting, and that conversation was very long, but he selected option 3. Actually, it was not option 5. So just a quick correction on that. I wanted to let the board know that that's what was coming out of Virginia during our public hearings. Thank you.
Yes, Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you mind returning to figure 11? Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to ask this question to make sure that I understand and that everybody else understands. So if we, whichever of these levels we decide to fish at, we are, our goal is to get to 125% of whatever the reference period is that we choose. So my question I want to make really sure is that if we're fishing at the particular cap, do we have any idea how long it'll take to get us to that 125% or 150% of the reference period? I guess that's my question in a nutshell is do we have any means to know? And the reason I ask that is because there is a phrase in the peer review report that says that the management action will not necessarily create a population response. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear on what we're going to get for a management response as we make this choice.
Thanks, Lynn. So I think like all of the species we manage, the answer is no, we can't predict exactly how management is going to impact the population. With eel, as you know, there are a number of factors that affect the population. It's coast-wide stock, so there's lots of things going on, and there is no population projection model.
Are there any other questions on the presentations before we move into discussion? Okay, seeing none, I'll open it up to the board for discussion. Is there anybody that wants to discuss the presentations? Craig Pugh, do you want to finish up your thought?
Point being that the catch effort has no indicative conclusion as to abundance. If the effort is not there, how can the landings that are entered into this have any meaning at all? There's as far as abundance. I guess that's my true question. Can you answer that to me, Caitlin? If there is, then that would be informative to me. I know there's been quite a drop off in effort, but with that, we also see them in a bycatch sort of situation in our blue crab fishery that shows a heavy abundance of these. But yet we don't necessarily market them, but we see them quite often to where they're a bit of a pain because they consume our bait before the crabs do. But at any rate, I guess that's more my question. Can you help me with that? Because that's my conclusion. Maybe I'm wrong, but if you can help me with that, I'd certainly like to hear it.
Yes, I think I can help. So went back to this graph because this is showing both the abundance index and the catch trend. Again, the catch is the black line, and that is what was on the last graph. But these two things are not related in our stock assessment models or in this iTarget model, but it's to show you how they line up with each other. What we were doing in the last graph is just simply showing how the actual catch would have compared to iTarget's recommendation of catch.
Yes, Russell Dice.
What Craig Peter was talking about with the catch per unit effort. There is no catch per unit effort now in my area of the bay. Everyone's had to quit because it's very expensive to go out and try to catch eels without a market to sell them. If you look at the graph, once that graph goes down like that, that became when we could not sell the eels any longer. So you've got to look at that point. In my area at Tillman Island, the middle of Maryland's portion of the bay, we had loads of people catching eels. Since, if you look at the graph and the time period, since that happened, since we could not sell them anymore, it gone down because we don't have, in my area, we have no catch effort. Another thing, you've got to look at where the technical committee are getting their information. I looked into it a little bit. The 4 points in the Hudson River, which I can't say where they are because I don't know. But if you go to the Hudson River and you got to do it's over a 10-year period, it may be nothing. In the set, they do one in Maryland, one, and that's in the upper reaches of the Chesapeake Bay Sassafras River. And the Sassafras River is full of blue cats and snakeheads. No eels. They're going to eat them up. Matter of fact, they're going to eat the rockfish up too. So this whole thing is really swayed because you can't get an accurate accounting for what is out there. We got bukus, like Craig said, we got bukus or yellow eel in our area. So many that we're complaining about it in our crabbing operations. So I think this whole thing has been swayed one way to several factors. Craig pointed out the bait. The other factor is you cannot sell the eels, so you're not going to catch it. And I think in your report, you said you were not going to use the CPUE anymore. If you don't use that, how in the world can you tell what is out there if you're not going to take the CPUE from it? I just don't understand that, because we got no one catching them. So if you don't have anyone catching them, you're not going to be able to tell what the effort was. I don't understand the whole thing. Thank you.
Kristen, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, just one point of clarification is that you aren't being punished for the current low catches by the iTarget method. So these recent low catch, we acknowledge that that's because of market, because of COVID, because of all those things. The index is what's determining how you're adjusting your catch recommendation. So just to make sure that's clear to the board, is there's no, like the 2020 low catches are not driving the low recommendation. As for the indices, I totally agree with you. I would love to have more indices for eel. The TC and the SAS would love to have more to consider to put into this tool. So the ones that we took to make this abundance index that you see up there were the best indices we had available to us. Certainly we were not cherry picking them. And we did look into the Hudson River issue as tasked by the board. And it does have an effect on the overall trend of this, but the Hudson River is part of the coastwide stock, and it wasn't one of the Hudson River indices driving this. They all were telling the same story. So they do have an effect, but they are also part of the stock, an important part of the stock, because they provide some historical data. I hope that helps answer a couple questions.
Yes, Russell.
But I would like to give you a scenario. I'm on several of the oyster reviews that are on panels in Maryland. Also, captain of skipjack, maroon skipjack for 28 years. And if you go out dredging oysters, you go on the oyster bottom, but I can take you to 1,000 places where there's neither oyster, not one. I say you should be doing you should be taking your feedback where you're testing should be If you see you're not getting any, try something different. I mean, I would fail as a waterman if I went out and did the same thing every time and kept going down. I mean, it doesn't make sense. If you come to the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, down into our area, you're gonna find bukus of yellow eel. But if you never test it, you're never gonna see it. And we can't prove it now because we can't sell the eels. So it's a no-win situation. I just think that this is a flawed scenario from start to finish. I'm very unhappy with it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and perspective, Mr. Dice. John Clark.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, are you ready to start considering motions on this, or?
I was about to, if there was no more discussion, but I did see one more hand here before yours, Shanna Madsen, and then we'll go into entertaining motions.
Thank you. It's just a quick clarifying question because I've heard this misconception a lot of times when discussing iTarget. Dr. Anstead, correct me if I'm wrong, but the current catch levels are not what's being considered in iTarget or referenced in iTarget. You're actually referencing back to the average catch during the reference period. So iTarget isn't working in those periods of low catch that people are concerned with.
That's correct. So the significance of choosing a reference period is you're choosing the average catch during that reference period. So if you use the older reference period, your average catch during that earlier period gets adjusted by the fishery independent index. We don't have any fishery dependent CPUEs in here. And so depending on where your current index is compared also to that reference period is how it's adjusting that historic catch to make a catch recommendation.
Thank you for that question and explanation. So I think we're at the point here where we are exhausting our discussion. So let's go ahead and get into motions. I know John Clark had tried to offer one previously. So go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I don't think anybody will be surprised considering the comments I've made about this addendum in the past that I would move to approve under 3.1 issue 1 option 1 that we go with status quo. And if I can get a second, I can speak to that.
Do we have a second? Russell Dice. Okay, John. Would you like to speak to that motion?
There are a bunch of reasons here. I think, not just the fact that anybody who has fished commercially for eels, as mentioned as Craig and Russell have, that the yellow eel stock in the areas where it is fished, where the fishery is in very good shape. But I want to consider all the points here. So defining the stock as overfished was rejected by the peer review. I appreciate all the work the stock assessment subcommittee put into this, but the fact that when the assessment came out, it was actually recommended considering the stock overfished, I thought was a gross overreach, and I was very heartened to see the peer review reject that and continue the depleted. And, as we saw from 2019 to 2022, catches dropped from 60% of the cap to 35% of the cap. I mean, this is a market-driven fishery. I would say, I know that Russell and Craig have spoken about the catch per effort being a problem. I think what it actually shows when we look at what's been going on out there, I look at Delaware, where, as Craig said, because of the lack of bait, we've had a huge drop off in effort. We've had new people come in. They're not using as good a bait, but there are plenty of eels out there because our catch per effort every year, which is not used in the assessment, has remained steady. We also want to look at the attempts to link eel declines and parts of its range to overall declines in the population that haven't occurred. Before I was a fish bureaucrat, I was actually a field biologist, and I worked with eels a lot. I did a lot of onboard sampling with commercial eelers, and I think that the eel biology, especially in the estuaries where the fishery is prosecuted, as I've said before, is very unique. I could be out in a we'd go into a small gut, put out 4 or 5 pots. You'd load up with eels. You might get that for 2 or 3 days. After that, they're gone. You pull the pots. You leave it alone for a couple of weeks. You come back, the eels are back. It's just the way it is in the estuaries. The eels there don't stay very long there. They pretty much mature. We rarely see eels older than 5 or 6 years old, whereas the eels that made it inland, like the huge eels they used to see in Lake Ontario, that was a 20 to 30-year-old eel. Back when this whole process started to manage eels, the concern is that the extirpation of eels from Lake Ontario was the signal that the species was going extinct. We haven't seen that happen. I think the indices in the Canadian Maritimes have been steady. What they're seeing up in Maine with the life cycle study, which is again at the northern end of the range, shows that there's still plenty of eels, yellow eels out there. And I want to point out in the assessment that the only survey that targets eels with eel gear actually showed a significant increase. And this is the Maryland survey that takes place in the Sassafras River. And even the decline mentioned for the stock, using the Mars model, it said it straight in the stock assessment that although the Mars model fit to yellow and Young of the Year time series suggested a slightly declining population, the 95% confidence intervals on population growth rate estimates overlap 0, suggesting a stable population. So, we'd be taking a very harsh measure here, I think, based on not too much. And I think the whole iTarget method is almost as arbitrary as using the cap we have now, which is based on landing. So I don't see, we're going from one form of expert opinion to another form of expert opinion. This one tries to objectify it a little bit more, but it's essentially that. And just got a couple more points here, so please bear with me. I would say that the separating the yellow eel and considering it overfished or trying to reduce the cap while leaving the glass eel quota status quo is almost a cognitive dissonance here. I mean, you need yellow eels to go out and reproduce to produce glass eels, obviously. If there are plenty of glass eels out there, clearly the stock is doing something right to keep producing that. And even though in Delaware, our catches have really dropped off, we're not the major player in eels that we were 15, 20 years ago, and mostly, as Craig said, because of the female horseshoe crabs, which of course is another fraught issue. The fact is that lowering the cap will lead to bureaucratic burdens and make it more difficult for the future of people who want to get into this fishery. One of the things that's nice about eels in Delaware and other states is it's a easy fishery to enter. It's pretty low capital investment to get started. And every time we make one of these fisheries more difficult for young people to get into, we got to start thinking about the next generations of commercial fishing and give them some options to get into this that don't require them to try to get a gill net license or a crabbing license transferred to them that could end up costing a lot of money. So I think for all those reasons, I certainly understand the work done and the trends with eels with the population. It would have been nice to see the population show some increases by now, but the fact is that it's basically holding stable. We have a market-driven fishery that, I'm mostly saying here, it's not broken, let's not fix it. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the detailed rationale for the motion. Given the thoroughness of your response and your rationale, I'll still go to Russell Dice to see if you want to add anything additional that's new to what John had just said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything John said. But I have a note here that in 2022, 300,000 pounds of glass eels were sent into Hong Kong. we had better get a handle on what's happening, because it's my understanding, maybe Ms. Stark can keep me straight on it, that all eels spawned in the Sargasso Sea, right? So if they all spawn there, that means that's 300,000 pounds of of glass eels. And every pound of glass eels has 2,000 eels in it. Do the figuring on it. This is what's coming out. Where they're coming from, I don't know, but we should try to find out. I know that Haiti didn't catch 200,000 pounds of glass eels last year, but that's what they say they caught. So they're coming from somewhere else. And it would behoove us to find out where they're coming from for the industry to survive. Thank you, sir.
Okay, appreciate those comments. So let's stay focused on the motion here with yellow eels. We had heard the rationale, so I'll open it up for discussion on the motion. Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess we might as well paint the corners here. I'm going to offer up a substitute motion. That would be to move to approve under 3.1, issue 1, option 2, coast-wide caps at 202,453 pounds using the iTarget configuration recommended in the 2023 benchmark stock assessment.
We have a second. Rick Jacobson. Okay, Jason, would you like to, Justin, sorry, would you like to provide rationale for your motion?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, from my standpoint, I think the board has two decisions in front of it today. The first being whether we want to adopt the iTarget approach for management, and if we do, what sort of settings we want to use for the iTarget. And then given the depleted state of the stock, whether we want to take action today that's likely to provide conservation benefit in the immediate time frame. From my standpoint, I think we should adopt the iTarget approach for management. I like it because it formalizes our goals and what we're trying to achieve and provides a clear pathway for what to do to get to those goals. I think it makes the best use of the available information we have for this data poor species. And I think the settings recommended in option 2 are appropriate. I think it's the appropriate reference period, that older time period when its obvious abundance was much higher. The multiplier, I like the 1.25 because it's not setting the goal too high, but the threshold is conservative at 0.8. So it suggests that we'll be conservative, at least in the near time frame, to try to achieve that goal. From my standpoint, also of the options in front of us here, option 2 is the only one that is likely to achieve conservation in the near term for the species that's depleted. And I can understand the viewpoint that because we don't have a robust stock assessment model that gives us estimates of biomass and reference points and tells us, what F is and how F is impacting our ability to get those reference points. The stock is depleted. I think it's in need of conservation, and I think we should take action today that's likely to provide that conservation in the near term. So for those reasons, I support option 2.
Thank you for that rationale. Rick Jacobson, seconder, would you like to provide some additional rationale?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything that Dr. Davis has just said. Specifically identifying that the peer review did agree with the working group that the stock is in fact depleted. I also acknowledge that the peer review group, although it determined that by virtue of the iTarget, we could not conclude that the stock was overfished, it also did not conclude that the stock was not overfished. It may in fact be. And we strive to make our management decisions based on the best available science. However imperfect it might be, the iTarget approach does represent the best available science to us. And as a result of that, option 2 represents the recommendation coming out of the iTarget to have the most likely opportunity to rebuild the stock. And that's why I'm in favor of it.
Thank you, Rick. Discussion on the substitute motion. Lynn Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I absolutely oppose this motion. And I hope that the board has heard a little bit what my colleagues who commercially fish for these animals around the table are saying. This is a really difficult problem. And I think everybody around the table would acknowledge that there are issues with American eel and it needs some attention. But I think everybody would also acknowledge, particularly in light of option 2, that we are in a state right now where carrying capacity has changed. There are so many factors around us, particularly for American eel, everything from habitat degradation, fish passage, climate change, that I just don't even know that it is realistic to think that we're going to get back to 1999. If I could get back to where I was when I graduated from high school in a lot of ways, I'd be really excited about that, but it's not going to happen. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I think it's really important to, if we're going to take action on this animal, to set our goals in a reasonable way that are attainable, particularly because with this method, we really don't know that these catch targets are going to get us to where we want to go. I think that iTarget is clever, but at the end of the day, we're arguing over about 400,000 pounds of eels, and there's a lot of places where we could focus our attention and maybe make a difference. I think it's also worth noting that, you know, one of my issues also is that the terminal year for this is 2019. So we're in 2024. So we've basically been sort of doing this moratorium experiment for the last 3 years. You know, we've been fishing at very low levels. And frankly, I would like to see what those catch targets would look like with I'd like to see the indices in the last 3 years and see what those look like. And to just bring a finer point on it, that terminal year seems to coincide very well, coincidentally, with when the market fell out. So I think and that is really hard for our commercial fishermen in Maryland to wrap their heads around. You know, this is a group of people who voluntarily took action a number of years ago to curtail Maryland's harvest to make sure that we were not going to exceed the cap. I mean, they really care about this resource. They're not catching the eels right now. So really we're talking about removing opportunity more than revenue. But I'm a little uncomfortable. I fear that this is this is sort of management that is, it's a little bit nonsensical from the ground. So I oppose this motion, and thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you for your comments. I saw Shanna Madsen.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of discuss both motions because now they're up there. I would not support either of these motions. I was looking for a motion on option 3. I believe that option 3 affords us a lot of flexibility that the SAS and the peer reviewers actually allowed. So in going back to the reports, the peer reviewers and the SAS noted that they really did not know what level to set the threshold at. They begged us to keep the reference period and they begged us to keep the multiplier, but they said, you can vary the reference period, threshold, because we don't know exactly what that threshold should be. So for me, I would prefer to go with a less conservative threshold, which gives a nod to my compatriots a little bit north of me, in that we're saying, you know, we recognize this is a depleted stock. It is not an overfished stock. I understand the difference there. Mr. Jacobson, I see you over there. But I think that setting to a higher threshold still curtails what the opportunity might look like. I also think that with any fishery, you have that uncertainty of not knowing whether or not the actions that you take are going to result in an actual change in the index or in the fishery, but that doesn't mean we don't do them. So with a stock that's depleted, I have to say that I would support option 3, just to kind of try to find some sort of balance in here and still have an iTarget that was recommended by the SAS and the peer reviewers. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Shanna. So we've heard 2 in opposition. The makers and seconder provided rationale for the motion. So at this point, I think we're ready to call the question. So is there a need to caucus? All right, 2 minutes for caucus. Okay, 2 minutes are up. So where we are in the agenda right now is that I'm not going to accept public comment on this motion at this time. We had a hearing on it and we received public comments in written format. So I would like to call a question. So all those in favor, raise your hands. So all those in favor, raise your hands.
Connecticut U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
All those opposed?
And no fisheries, sorry. Thanks, Caitlin. For opposed, it is Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. This is very tricky. Is that Shanna? South Virginia. I just couldn't see you. District of Columbia and Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire. PRC, sorry.
Any null votes? Abstentions? The motion fails 3-16. And so now we're back to the main motion. Shanna Madsen.
I'd like to make another motion to substitute. Motion to substitute to replace under section 3.1, issue 1, option 3, the coastwide cap being set at 518.281.
Do we have a second? Dan McKiernan. Okay, Shannon, would you like to provide some rationale in addition to what you had already provided on previous comments?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it short since I already spoke to this. Again, I think that it's really important for us to be listening to the SAS and the TC here. They have an entire section in one of the documents that they asked for from us regarding the fact that this is not how we normally respond to a stock being depleted. Most of our depleted stocks actually have a moratorium. But again, recognizing that we're in a place where there's been some question about what the fishery is doing, I am comfortable with varying the threshold, which is what the SAS and the peer reviewers recommended if we wanted some flexibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Any additional rationale? No. Okay, discussion on the motion. Yes, Steve Train.
I can reluctantly support this motion. I would rather have seen the original or option 5. And let me explain this. It's not the eels I'm worried about, it's the fishermen. I'm a commercial fisherman. I understand fisheries behavior. Fishermen worry that they are being punished for not catching eels. If this quota gets dropped too low versus staying where it was, if it stayed where it was, they would continue to fish to what the market needed. We might not land much. If they're worried they're going to lose quota because they didn't land enough eels, they'll catch 519,000 pounds. If it was 700,000 or 900,000, they might only catch 3. So I worry that if you really want to protect the eels, you don't want to cut it so low enough that they max it out. If this is what we're going to get to allow this fishery to proceed, I can support it, but I'm worried it's going to backfire.
Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just didn't quite get my hand up fast enough. I would actually speak in opposition of this motion, mainly because, and I understand the reference period, but I have absolute concerns. I would prefer to use the same criteria for iTarget and set the reference period to that more recent reference period, because I believe it more reflects the ecological state of our world and it's a more realistic goal. And that would be option 5. So I feel like that is something we can set our sights on. Dr. Davis made the point that it formalizes our goals, it formalizes where we want to get to, it accommodates Mr. Train's comment about really treating this carefully. You know, again, we're talking about opportunity. We're not talking about catch right now. And the perception that it's penalizing commercial fishermen for a catch, and this sort of disconnect in the life cycle of the animal. I would really like to see us get a handle on glass heels, and finally I would really like to see the index results for the last 3 years before we drop the quota beyond that option 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. I saw a hand from Joe Semino.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to speak in favor of the motion. You know, this is I think a species with a life cycle that makes this tough to manage. But some of the comments around the table have really concerned me. I mean, we've all sat through the very important climate scenario planning, and moving into greater uncertainty is very likely the future of fisheries management. So we're going to have to make tough decisions, and I think this is one where we're trusting the folks that have spent the most time looking at this and giving, you know, the best available science and advice that they can on this, while still balancing, you know, the socioeconomic issues. I mean, some of the conversations around the table sound like people are ready to hang up their spurs and just give up because we don't have great information. But unfortunately, if we're going to sit around this table, we're going to have to make these tough decisions. I think this is the best balance, and the reason why I'm really supporting it is because I am trusting the folks that, you know, put in so much time and effort on this, and trying to support them and where they think we should go. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I saw a hand from Jesse Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak in support of this motion. I think this is the right balance for this option. You know, currently commercial harvest is about 350,000 pounds. So this option allows a commercial fishery to grow should market conditions improve in the future. But it sets the cap at a level that that's not 3 times or greater than what's recommended in the assessment. So it's a nice balance between the two. And you know, option 2 would potentially, you know, shut down the fishery, and I think option 5, or the status quo option, would just potentially put the stock at further risk of depletion if those options were selected. Thanks.
Thank you for that. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm opposed to this motion. Obviously I spoke in favor of status quo. One of the things we keep talking about, best available science, one of the things I find extremely frustrating is that I've been either on the TC or on the management board on eels since 1997. Every time an assessment comes up, it's like, okay, well, we don't have data to say more than this limited amount about it. We have these surveys, these fishery independent surveys, most of them which are not designed to catch eels, and they're limited in their appropriateness for using for eels, I think. And, you know, it's every time it's like, well, states need to go out and get more data, and it doesn't happen. And we end up in this feedback loop where it's depleted. We should do something. I mean, we did something with the cap, which was based on the empirical data that we had from the fishery itself. And we have taken actions based on the coast-wide cap we have in place. I think if states are really that concerned about eels, they should look into doing more work on this. I mean, we're one of the few states that has consistently gone out and gotten otoliths from eels, gone to the commercial fishermen and seen what they're doing, and gotten their samples of eels to get the data that's needed for these things. And it's not done throughout the range. As I've said before, I think right now we have almost two different populations of eels. I think the eels, especially the further they get from the coast, these eels are having very huge difficulties. I mean, as we've seen what's happened in Lake Ontario, whereas in the estuaries, especially the two where they're probably the biggest eel fisheries in the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay, the eels seem to be doing fine. Now, again, is that something that would allow us to just keep fishing the way we've been fishing? I think so at the current levels of that we're seeing, even up to the cap. I don't think that's going to be a problem, but that's my opinion. And I'm just wanted to weigh in that I'm just a little to say that this is the best science when we just have 5 more years of the same stuff every time the assessment takes place. Thanks.
Thank you, John. We've had considerable discussion on this motion. Is there a need to caucus before we call the question? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and call the question. All those in favor?
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, District of Columbia, New Hampshire, and NOAA Fisheries.
All those opposed?
Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine.
Any null votes? Abstentions? The motion passes 12-7. So the motion now becomes the main motion. We've had considerable discussion on this. Is there a need for any additional discussion or a need for caucus before we decide upon this motion that's on the board now? Lynn Fegley?
Hopefully, I'm just going to try it. I'm going to move to substitute the main motion for option 5.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Was that option 5?
Yes, I second guessed myself, but yes, option 5. Thank you.
Do we have a second? Steve Train? Lynn, you want to provide additional rationale from what you've already provided for your support for option 5?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've said all I can say.
Mr. Train?
I think I explained my rationale for that on the last one.
Any discussion on the substitute motion? Adam Nowalski.
So I'd like to add that while I disagree with my state commissioners to my left on the last motion, I completely agree with the comments that Mr. Semino made, that we should listen to the people that know the most about this resource. And I say that without any disrespect to the hundreds or thousands of hours of research, model work that has gone into this, because they are doing the absolute best that they can. But I can say this with almost 100% certainty, that the two people sitting around this table that know the most about the health of this resource are Mr. Pugh and Mr. Dies. And I have no qualms sitting here today saying that to make a management decision based on industry making sacrifices on their own in the past, having their bait taken away from them, having their market taken away from them, and for us to respond to that by further punishing them and taking away opportunity sends the complete wrong message of everything that we are here to do in terms of both managing the resource as well as being good stewards of the public that we are sent here to represent. Thank you.
Any additional discussion on the substitute motion? Any need to caucus before we call the question? Seeing none, we'll get right to it. So all those in favor, please raise your hands.
New Jersey, Georgia, South Carolina, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine.
All those opposed?
NOAA Fisheries,
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Fish and Wildlife Service, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, District of Columbia, and New Hampshire.
Any null votes? Abstentions? The motion fails 7-12. So now we're going to go back to the underlying motion, which is option 3. Do we have a need for any discussion? Caucus? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and call the question for option 3. Can we get set up on the, have that up on the board? Okay, all those in favor for the motion up on the board, option 3, raise your hands.
NOAA Fisheries, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Fish and Wildlife Service, Pennsylvania, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, District of Columbia, Maine, New Hampshire.
All those opposed?
Delaware, Maryland, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Florida.
Null votes? Abstentions? So the motion passes 15-4. Okay, so we still have a number of decision points that we have to come here to today regarding the items that were covered in the presentation. I'm going to get right to asking for if anybody has any motions regarding the management response to exceeding the coastwide cap, the time frame for how long the selected coastwide cap would remain in place, annual young a year abundance survey requirements, catch and effort monitoring requirements, and American eel de minimis criteria. And feel free to wrap some of those into a single motion if you so choose. Yes, Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a motion and I'm going to wrap two issues together. One is a little bit out of order, but they both apply a little bit to the status quo issue. So the motion is to approve for section 3.1, issue 2, option 1, which is the status quo that states over 1% of the coastwide landings will participate in the reductions, and then also to approve for section 3.5, option 2, which is that we will use the 3-year landings average for de minimis. Thank you.
Do we have a second? John Clark. Lynn, would you like to speak to that motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just these are consistent with the Commission's de minimis policy. I think they're clear. I think they're, I don't have a lot to say except that they're straightforward and seem appropriate.
John Clark, a seconder.
What Lynn said.
Okay, any discussion on the motion? Is there, yes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Our fishery is very market driven and quite variable. So with the reduction, with this motion, the motion that previously passed, reducing the catch, we feel it might be more appropriate to increase instead of doing the greater than 1% to 5%. So Florida would be opposed to this.
Thank you. Any additional discussion? Yes, Chris Baskavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. North Carolina is in a very similar situation with Florida regarding the 1% threshold. Thanks.
Further discussion? Okay, seeing none, is there a need to caucus? Okay, seeing none, go ahead and call the vote. All those in favor?
I'm listening that time. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, District of Columbia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire.
All those opposed?
Florida, North Carolina.
Null votes? Abstentions?
No Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service.
Motion passes 15 to 2 to 0 to 2. Okay, so we still have a few items here to deal with. The time frame on how long the selected coastwide cap would remain in place, as well as annual young a year abundance and catch and effort monitoring requires. I see Shannon Madsen. Do you have a motion?
I do. I have moved to approve under section 3.2, option 1, a 3-year coastwide cap duration.
Do we have a second? John Clark. Shannon, rationale?
My rationale here is 3 years was kind of deemed appropriate by the SAS as a time for us to come back to the table and reassess what's going on with the stock. They didn't want anything shorter, but this tells us, I think, an appropriate amount of time, whether we have good news or bad news. And I think it's important for us to have that check in every 3 years. Thanks.
John?
Yes, I agree that the sooner we can check this again, the better.
Any discussion on the motion? Is there a need to caucus? Okay, again, seeing none, we'll go ahead and call the question. All those in favor, please raise your hands.
No Fisheries, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, DC, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire.
All those opposed? Are there any abstentions?
Fish and Wildlife Service.
The motion passes 18 to 0 with 1 abstention. Okay, so we're getting there. We still need to address the annual young a year abundance and survey requirements, as well as catch and effort monitoring requirements. Jeff Kalin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve for section 3.3, option 1, and for section 3.4, option 1, status quo.
We have a second? Lynn Fegley. Jeff, would you like to speak to that?
Well, we're clearly in a very data poor situation with this fishery, and I can't see relaxing the requirements to continue to bring information to the table, particularly from the fishery dependent side of the equation. So that's my rationale.
Lynn, no follow-up? Okay, I see John Clark's hand up.
Yes, I would just like to make a motion to amend on section 3.3 I think at this point we can go with option 2. I know from doing much of the pigmentation staging and the sampling of glass eels over the year, it's pretty much the same thing year in, year out, sample. I think we've got plenty of data from that. I don't think we need to do that. Whereas I fully agree with section 3.4 that we want to keep getting the cash per unit effort data. So if I can get a second on that.
So we have a motion to amend the substitute, second from Doug Grout. John, would you like to provide some rationale?
I think I jumped the gun and just did,
Yeah.
but
Additional rationale, we'll say. None? Doug? Okay. Any need for discussion on the substitute motion, or the motion to amend the substitute, rather? Okay, seeing none. Need to caucus? Okay, we'll go ahead and call the question. All those in favor, raise your hands. All those opposed? Abstentions? Any null votes? The motion passes 14 to 2 to 1 to 0. With one abstention. Emerson.
Yeah, we had our hand up late here because we were still caucusing. So where did you have New York on this?
Just tell us what your vote is.
Just go ahead and tell us what your vote is. We didn't capture that.
We'd be in favor of this one.
So the motion passes 15 to 2 with one abstention. Okay, bear with us. We have a slight correction to the tally, so it's 16 to 2 with one abstention. Motion passes. Okay, so now we're at this becomes the main motion. Chris Batscavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to offer a motion to amend or substitute because I think I can count the votes in my head, but to speak in opposition to option 1 for section 3.4, we would prefer it be voluntary collection of fishery dependent CPUE information. As it was stated in the document, that this has not been used really for any of the assessments. I think it does help inform management in some states, and those states can certainly continue to collect that information. Just speaking from North Carolina's perspective, we do collect that information. It's probably more trouble than it's worth, quite frankly, in terms of just the administrative work to collect this information from what's left of our eel fishery. It would definitely speed up the process for our staff to get compliance reports in and other things like that. But yeah, I'll just at least voice my opposition. Yeah, I don't think other people feel the same way as us, but at least get on the record. Thanks.
Dan McKiernan.
I'd like to speak in favor of the motion, specifically reflecting the report that Caitlin gave yesterday about horseshoe crab use in some of these fisheries. I think it's important for us as fishery managers to understand the waxing and waning effort levels in fisheries that use horseshoe crabs, and that's why I'd like to support this.
Okay, moving this along, is there a need to caucus before we call the question? Okay, I think we're ready to do so. All those in favor, please raise your hands. You may lower your hands. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Null votes? No. So the motion passes 18 to 1. Okay, just checking with Caitlin and Kristen, I think we've covered everything we needed to. Is there anything there? Yeah, before we get to final approval, we've covered what we need to do. So at this time, we're ready to consider final approval of addendum 7. Is there anyone willing to make a motion for that? Emerson Hasbrook. Do we have a second? Roy Miller. Emerson, would you like to speak to the motion?
I'll read it into the record first. Move to approve addendum 7 to the American Eel FMP as modified today. I don't have anything to add other than all the discussion that we've had this afternoon around this, and I think we ended up at a compromise position.
Roy Miller. Any comments?
Nothing further.
Yes, Doug Grout.
Just a question, do we have to put in some dates for compliance at all, or does that come after we approve this?
You could do it as part of the same motion or afterwards.
So is there a need to caucus? Seeing no need to caucus, is there any opposition to the motion? Okay, seeing none, the motion passes by board consent. So we now need to set implementation dates. Is there anyone willing to make a motion regarding implementation dates? Lynn Fegley.
Just at the risk of maybe being a little tired at the end of the day, I'm just curious how we implement something that isn't actually happening. Because we're not catching, we're not coming close to the cap, but I guess it wouldn't be reasonable to implement it for the next fishing year.
I guess I can try to help. So if you were to make it effective immediately, I think that would mean this year you would have to have that cap in place. And then if you want to have it for the following fishing year, I think you would want it to be in place for January 1.
And I guess you all can also consider that if the quota is going to be effective for next year, you would say January 1 for the quota provisions. And if you wanted the sampling provisions to be effective for this year, then you could say those would be effective immediately.
In light of the guidance provided by Caitlin and Tony, is there a motion to set implementation dates? John Clark.
I'd prefer to set the implementation date as January 1, 2029, but I mean 2020, 2025.
Do we have a second? I can't see.
No.
Is that Joe? Yeah. Joe Semino. Okay, any discussion on the motion? We'll give it a minute until it comes up on the board. Okay, the motion's up on the board, which is moved to approve an implementation date of January 1, 2025. Motion made by Mr. Clark, seconded by Mr. Semino. Is there any opposition to the motion? Okay, seeing none, the motion passes by board consent.
Chris, you have your hand up in objection.
Yeah, I think it should be implemented this year. So I vote no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, since we have opposition, I'm going to ask for a raise of hands of everyone that's in favor of the motion. Please raise your hand. Okay, motion passes 18-1. Okay, bear with us. I think we're getting there. So Caitlin would like to make one point of clarification before we move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make it clear that with this implementation date, that means we will provide an updated cap for consideration before 2028. So in 2027, we will rerun it with the 3 years of data that we have additional and then provide an option or a recommendation for 2028.
Okay, moving on. The next item on the agenda is to elect a vice chair for the American Eel Management Board. Do I have any nominations? Joe Semino.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to nominate Jesse Hornstein from New York for the American Eel Management Board Vice Chair. Thank you.
Do I have a second? Lynn Fegley. Any discussion around the motion? Is there any opposition to the motion? Motion passes by board consent. So welcome, Jesse Hornstein. And so at this point, we're ready to entertain any other new business. Tony Kearns.
Thanks, Chris. I think it was Russell earlier that had asked the question about the glass eel that are showing up in Hong Kong. And I just wanted to let the board know that Caitlin and I provide information for CITES reports that do go out. We provide the information on what the US landings are, but in those CITES reports, oftentimes the United States gets accounted for a higher value of landings than what is actually coming out of the US. It's just that because the eel transfer through a flight through the United States, sometimes we get credited for those landings, even though they may be coming from Haiti or Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic or anywhere else. And we keep making recommendations that there is a start to finish tracking of where those eel are coming from to CITES, and we don't sit on CITES as the commission. NOAA Fisheries does for the US government. I believe it is NOAA that does. So we make those recommendations and we will keep doing so, but just to clarify some information on where those yellow eel are coming from. And those reports do come out of CITES, or glass eel, sorry. That's all.
Thank you for that, Tony. Roy Miller.
Mr. Chairman, I noticed when going through the meeting materials that there was a publication called Early Warning of an Upsurge in International Trade in the American Eel by Shirashi and Kaifu, a publication that I found an apparent mistake in the first paragraph because it says American eel A. rostrata are classified as endangered. To the best of my knowledge, they've never been classified as endangered. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that point of clarification. And Caitlin has a response to that as well.
Thanks. In that article, it is referring to the IUCN classification. It is not classified that way in the United States, but IUCN does classify it that way.
Okay, I think that gets us to the end of our business. I appreciate everyone's participation this afternoon. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Second? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.